with that lovely voice. All right, next slide, please. So just a quick overview of today's agenda. First, we'll provide some history and context to our survey series, and then we'll go into the survey methodology, our key findings and recommendations, and then we'll finish off with a case study example of how Michigan has used these findings to inform their own work. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for some Q&A. Next slide, please. And just as an intro to us speakers, we shared some lovely photos of us as children enjoying our own little childhood with like a little apple there, loving the fruits from day one. But I'm Sophia Reamer-Bope, Program Manager at National Farm to School Network, leading our Farm to ECE work, including co-coordination of the National Farm to ECE survey.
And I'm Megan Shedd with the Bowl Cut, and I work with Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems, where I am an assistant professor in Farm to ECE and K-12 education.
All right, thank you, Megan. I want to go into our survey, but first just wanted to share some information about National Farm to School Network for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We're a national nonprofit that works with partners in communities across the country to support more equitable and resilient food systems through farm to school and farm to early care and education. And we are built on a network model of partners and stakeholder members from every state and many territories. And next slide, please.
And Michigan State University's Center for Regional Food Systems has a vision of a thriving economy, equity, and sustainability for Michigan, but also the country and our planet through food systems that are rooted in local regions and centered on good food that is healthy, green, fair, and affordable. At the center, we help people and organizations working to improve the food systems to be more effective. So that's growers, processors, aggregation and distribution, entrepreneurs, and institutional food service. We also produce applied research and educational materials that help inform advocates, educators, and decision makers. Networks and networking are really the heart of our work with all of these groups. And while the bulk of our work is at the state level, we also engage with collaborating partners and some important national benchmarking studies, and we're a core partner with the National Farm to School Network. And this has led to an opportunity to partner with the National Farm to School Network. We were partners with the 2018 Farm to ECE survey, and then more recently, this 2021 Farm to ECE survey, which we'll be talking about more today. So this leads us into today's conversation about the 2021 Farm to ECE Provider Survey. And Sophia and I have had a chance to present on this a couple of times. And so some of you may have joined us before. And then we're taking a little bit of a different viewpoint on it this time, but we'll provide some context just about the methodology and then resources and things of that nature. So let's pop over to the next slide just to provide some brief context about the survey. So in 2021, the National Farm to School Network and Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems, it's just a big mouthful of words, surveyed early care and education ECE providers across the country with a goal to better understand current initiatives, motivations, and challenges in applying farm to ECE activities in early care and education settings. For this survey, more than 2,900 providers in 26 states and DC responded and shared the benefits, but also the challenges of connecting young children to healthy local foods, gardening, and food and agricultural education through Farm to ECE. You may have received from either NFSN or the Association for Public Health Nutritionists, ASPHN, or even your local network, an email that announced the availability of the infographic. There was a fact sheet and a toolkit for sharing these items. In the chat, we could also share the link to the NFSN website where all of these items are housed, but there's also state level data. And this can also be really helpful for states to inform their work and also help them to engage in some policy and advocacy work. So we'll take a quick minute to, well, more than a quick minute, to talk about the data that was used to develop those resources, but then we're also going to dive a little bit more deeply into some recommendations and how states could use that information as well. So next slide. It's always fun to take a little bit of a walk down memory lane. And so let's take a quick peek back at the National Farm to ECE survey and how it's evolved over the last decade plus. So in 2012, the first survey was conducted, and this one was focused on farm to preschool. So you'll see a little bit of a name change happening. And this first iteration had 494 respondents. What's important to note about this particular version is that this only used responses from those who were already participating in farm to preschool. So those already engaged in that work. It had a flyer, and then there was a journal article that was published in 2016. So it took a couple of years for that to come out. In 2015, so 3 years later, there was a survey that included survey responses, but this time it included those survey responses from both those participating in Farm to ECE and those who were not participating in Farm to ECE. This survey had just under 1,500 respondents, and it had, of that, in that survey, of those 1,500 respondents, a little over half indicated that they were carrying out some type of Farm to ECE activity. And this was across 48 states and Washington, D.C. Another quarter indicated that they plan to start Farm to ECE activities in the next year. So now we fast forward to 2018, and we had 2,030 ECE providers responding to a survey from over 45 states and Washington, D.C. 49% indicated that they were engaged in Farm to ECE activities within the last year. And another 30% of those surveyed, remember that number is 2,030, said that they would intend to start implementing Farm to ECE activities in the future. The 2018 survey had an infographic, a fact sheet, and a pretty extensive evaluation summary. So one of the exercises that we love to engage in this work is, what's the headline? And I would offer a bit of caution in creating a headline when you look at these three snapshots or these screen grabs, because what we often want to do is say, Farm to ECE expands over the years. So that could be true, but the sampling methodology presents a limitation that would need to be coupled with that statement. So on the surface, we're seeing an increase in participation from the 2015 to the 2018 to 2021, 500 to 750 to 1,000. That's exciting. We're seeing a movement. But the caveat is that we're purely reporting numbers, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So next slide. This also takes us to the 2021 survey, and that survey had 4 primary goals. In this version, like the previous iterations, the research team wanted to learn more about Farm to ECE from that national perspective, estimating reach, again, from a national perspective. So the team also wanted to learn more about implementation of Farm to ECE activities, including the where and the what of those activities. Also, what was motivating ECE sites to implement Farm to ECE and barriers that might exist to implementation. Another aim was to determine if and what program and policy supports were needed to grow Farm to ECE from that national perspective. And because we were in the midst of the pandemic, COVID-19 specific questions were added to this particular survey to gain a better understanding of its effect, if any, on Farm to ECE. Next slide. So on this slide, you can see some of the graphics from the 2021 survey, which surveyed providers in 28 states and the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. And in contrast to previous years, which used a snowball sample, we saw that in 2012 and 2015, this year's survey, the 2021 version, built on the purposive sample that we used in 2018. And the goal was to obtain both a representative sample, but also to really tap into the diversity of ECE settings. So this was an attempt to reduce some of the response bias that we might have seen in previous years. The USDA regions were used as a guide for selection, with 4 states chosen within each of those 7 regions, so 4 times 7, 28, based on the farm to EC infrastructure. So what we mean by that is the extent to their establishment of external farm to EC funding, if there's a farm to EC network, and or if there are paid positions in support of farm to ECE. And then we also looked at the diverse groups within the states. And if you're curious or want to see more about the specific information for sampling, you can look at the background and methods section's research brief. The survey was also delayed due to the pandemic, so it was distributed in fall of 2021 rather than spring as it had been in previous years. Next slide. So the most boring slide of all, the survey development. The survey was developed by the research team and then sent to experts in farm to ECE, and there was a specific ask with that vetting. So survey is long and we want to reduce that survey fatigue. So we asked them to pay specific attention to not only the questions to look for redundancy, but also just to pay attention to length to see if there was any way we could reduce the length of that survey. It was also piloted in a state that was known for high completion rates to also look for any potential issues. And then IRB approval was obtained, and then the consent form was embedded in the survey itself. Ultimately, it contained 53 questions, and it was intended to take about 20 minutes or less to complete. And to help the participants complete that survey or to facilitate the completion, we offered a pre-survey worksheet. And the idea was that it would gather any information a participant might need to help them complete that survey more easily. So things like food purchasing data were in that worksheet so they could fill that out ahead of time. The research team also made a request to state agencies for lists of provider emails in licensed and licensed exempt childcare, and that included providers in center-based and family childcare, Head Start, early Head Start, public and private preschools, preschool and childcare within K through 12 school districts, and tribal childcare. Of the 28 states, 18 provided contact lists, 2 states provided contact lists for centers only, 5 states sent the link directly to providers, and 2 states did not respond to requests, but a replacement state was not available. The survey was initially sent September 8th via Qualtrics for those states that were getting it directly from us, and the reminders were sent each week for 2 weeks, and it closed on September 29th. So in total, 95,149 emails were distributed across 25 states, and that gave us a response rate of 3.1%. And Sophia is going to go into the findings a little bit more in depth, but we had 2,914 total survey respondents with 2,397 participants indicating that they were participating in farm to ECE. So we analyzed the data, which summarized demographic characteristics, but then also conducted some chi-square test to look for associations between specific characteristics. So I'll turn it over to Sophia now to talk about findings.
All right, thank you, Megan, for setting the stage for us. Actually, before I go into findings, I wanted to do, there's always something. I want to do a quick poll of everyone here to get an idea of your familiarity with the 2021 survey. Give me 1 second. All right, so this poll just asks if you reviewed the survey. That can mean skimming it over. That can also mean reading it, front to back. And either answer is fine, but just kind of want to get an idea. All right, it looks like we're hitting around 30% yes, 70% no, which is great. I hope that, we can all get something out of today, no matter how familiar we were with the survey when we came in. Oh, and I'll share the results with you all. All right. Next slide. All right, now it's time for findings. Next slide. So starting off with some of our participation data, we found that, as Megan said, 81% of respondents participate in at least one farm to ECE activity. which was a nice number to see, but as we mentioned, we can't really compare to previous surveys. And from that, a third have been participating for more than 5 years and a quarter between 1 and 3 years. And now looking at facilitators for farm to ECE activities, farm to ECE participants that use a self-developed curriculum, receive funding from state sources, and engage in farm to ECE activities for 3 to 5 years, implemented approximately 1 more farm to ECE activity than others. So, being engaged in farm to ECE for a decent amount of time as a facilitator for more activities kind of reflects that suggestion that we always hear to start small and grow programs over time for success and sustainability. Using a self-developed curriculum as a facilitator for more activities was an interesting finding. We don't know exactly why this is, but it could be because a self-developed curriculum is tailored to a site, which may increase that site's ability to integrate farm to ECE activities into activities they're already doing. Or it could be because sites that had the time and resources to develop their own curriculum have more capacity in general for programming like farm to ECE. Next slide. So who's participating? Looking at some of our reach data, we were able to do some additional analysis this time around, and we found that sites where 75 to 99% of enrolled children were eligible for free and reduced price meals had the lowest number of farm to ECE participating respondents. And we also found that the percentage of Black and African American enrollees was statistically significantly higher. So the percentage of Black and African American children at the site was higher in sites not participating in farm to ECE than in those participating. We also found that the percentage of white enrollees was statistically significantly higher in sites that were participating in farm to ECE than in those not participating. So these findings do suggest socioeconomic and racial disparities in farm to ECE reach that need to be addressed, which we'll get a little bit more into in our recommendations. But I just wanted to highlight one more finding for this slide with reach. We did find that childcare centers and preschool or childcare through a K through 12 district are predictors of farm to ECE participation. And this may be because centers in preschool through a school district often have more capacity than, say, a small family childcare home with one person wearing many different hats. Or they might be working, in cooperation with the school district's farm to school program. But again, these are just some ideas for these findings. All right, next slide. So why farm to ECE? Now looking at our motivations that we saw from providers that we surveyed, the top motivation was improving children's health, followed by providing children with experiential learning, teaching children about where food comes from and how it's grown, and providing fresher or higher quality food to children. Respondents also named positive feedback on farm to ECE program from basically everyone that's involved in farm to ECE: children, families, staff, community members, and farmers and producers. All right, next slide. And when looking at the barriers that respondents reported, and we broke the barriers down in the survey questions to barriers to local food purchasing and barriers to farm to ECE activities, we see funding barriers as the top barriers to both local food purchasing and the cost and price of items, and to activities in limited funding for supplies. So funding is a clear barrier here. Knowledge barriers were also common, with top barriers including knowing how to order local items, obtaining information on produce availability, limited staff knowledge on local foods, and limited staff knowledge on gardening. And other barriers that we found included limited staff time and on-site storage, and limited access to appropriate curricula. Next slide. So we also looked at where funding was coming from With funding, we found that the majority of participants had not received external funding for farm to ECE activities, 82%. So it's a pretty high number. For those that had, the top sources were state sources and in-kind donations, followed by private sources. Next slide. And finally, looking at some of our CACFP related findings, we did find a statistically significant association between sites that received CACFP funding and sites that purchase and serve local foods, as well as the percentage of local food purchased. However, only 47% of respondents received CACFP funding. These findings highlight a few different things for us. One, CACFP does align and can support farm to ECE participation, and we see that reflected in our findings and in practice. And it aligns not only through, reimbursement, but also, targeted technical assistance, funding, and programming that all these wonderful organizations and states are doing in efforts to align CACFP and farm to ECE. And also we know that both, CACFP and farm to ECE can work together to support healthy food environments. And considering our earlier finding on the socioeconomic inequities within farm to ECE, I think we consider this yet another call to action to reduce barriers to CACFP participation. But with all of that, we also need to keep in mind and make sure that we're thinking about sites that aren't participating in CACFP with our farm to ECE efforts and how we can still reach them and support their goals. Next slide. So I wanted to give everyone just a moment to digest some of these findings before we move on to recommendations. And wanted us to consider some questions. And you can keep these answers to yourself, or you can add any reflections to the chat. It's totally up to you. But let's just think about, were there any findings that surprised you or maybe made your ears perk up? And what questions do these findings raise for us? Maybe about your role, your own community, maybe about the survey itself, opportunities. And are there any areas that we need to focus on as a community? So there's a lot of questions there, so I'll give everyone a moment just to think about that. See Nicole added in the chat, I would love to see USDA come out with CACFP equipment assistance grant like NSLP to make scratch cooking easier. Yes, definitely, that would address some of those findings that we saw.
I thought it was odd that people that lived in areas that were eligible for free school lunch program were the least amount of people, or the less farm to ECE participants.
Yeah, it
I
definitely
thought that
raises
was interesting.
Yeah,
Maybe we're not hitting those counties hard enough. I don't know.
thanks for sharing, Lisa. All right, I'm going to move on. So next slide, please. So now that we've had a second to think, we're going to go into some of our recommendations from these findings. And we had quite a few recommendations come out of this survey, and we broke them up into the topic areas listed here. And we're just going to highlight a few in the next couple of slides, but you can find the full set of recommendations in our brief compilation, where we break them up into these categories: partnership and network building, integrating farm to ECE into existing systems, policy and funding, and programming and resource development. And again, that link is in the chat a little bit higher up if you want to check that out. Next slide. So here are some recommendations tied to some of those findings that I mentioned. And, as I mentioned, this is by no means a comprehensive list. These are just a few examples. So to address the inequities we found in farm to ECE reach, we suggest funding specifically available and accessible to ECE sites serving Black children and families. And we know that there are inequities in the ECE system for other communities, but our findings only found a statistically significant association with white enrollees and Black and African American enrollees. So we really felt the need to honor that finding in our recommendation, both for accuracy and to platform the historical racism that finding reflects. And to address barriers related to funding, we recommend technical assistance, policy, and networking opportunities that emphasize pathways to funding with limited constraints. Limited constraints really being the emphasis here, as we know providers are already doing a lot. And so more paperwork is really not the goal here. And that's kind of related to our next recommendation, because providers are wearing a lot of hats. Farm to ECE, often can seem very overwhelming at first sometimes, especially for smaller sites where one or a few people are really doing everything. And so to address some of these knowledge barriers and address some of the equity issues, support systems can be incredibly important. And so we recommend building and expanding systems to connect providers to existing resources. So it's a little bit of a mouthful. And support organizations through infrastructure like networks and hubs and communities of practice. And, as a lot of us know, there's a lot out there that already exists as far as resources and support. And sometimes it's really just a matter of getting the right opportunities and the right resources into the hands of those that need it and want it. And then finally, to address the opportunities we found within CACFP, as well as the percentage of sites enrolled in the program, we recommend utilizing CACFP participation as a pathway to Farm to ECE and building stronger connection between these two programs. Really where Farm to ECE doesn't seem like something extra to do, but as core to that site's goals and providers' goals of creating healthy environments and helping them meet CACFP best practices. And this can be done through strategies such as CACFP-focused professional development, building Farm to ECE into CACFP positions, and including CACFP and Farm to ECE in farm to school funding opportunities and strategies. And again, with the emphasizing, but I really can't emphasize enough, the recommendation to include CACFP into NSLP related funding opportunities and strategies that are meant to reduce barriers to farm to school programming. Because as our farm to ECE movement grows, because of all of our great work and all providers' great work, we need to make sure that we are being put up front with farm to school. All right, next slide, please. So I thought I'd get a little more granular into some of our recommendations to address the inequities we found in our survey. And it's worth mentioning that those findings within Farm to ECE programming are really reflected in larger historical contexts and larger historical inequities and the root issues that we're seeing in our society, in food systems, and in ECE systems. So this is in no way special to Farm to ECE. And to address these disparities, we have to continue advocating within those systems while using Farm to ECE as the valuable tool it is to drive equity and to drive food justice, and really use Farm to ECE to its full potential. So in order to address barriers to historic inequities, again, we need to make investments and recommend funding available and accessible for ECE sites serving Black and African American children and families, as I mentioned before. But on top of that, we need to partner with organizations working to support Black families. These organizations should be prioritized in these efforts, uplifting those organizations that are already doing this important work. We also need to address—
I have a question about Hispanic families. Are they included in that mix or no?
We're gonna wait until the end for questions if you want.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Because that's our population. That applies to me. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah. Another recommendation we have for addressing inequities is addressing those financial barriers to Farm to ECE. One strategy is to reach sites with high proportions of children with that are eligible for free and reduced price meals, and to integrate farm to ECE opportunities into CACFP. Again, I know I'm repeating myself a little bit, but you know, we need to make sure that those not enrolled are not overlooked, like I mentioned, so we can extend funding opportunities to sites not participating in CACFP while still promoting CACFP visibility, as many providers don't even know that is an option, and reducing barriers to participation. And then finally, to make farm to ECE more accessible and impactful for all, farm to ECE activities and resources should honor children's home culture and language and traditions and lived experiences. So we recommend ensuring access to culturally adapted activities and culturally informed resources in the language spoken by families, children, and staff. All right, next slide. All right, so this is all fine and good, but how can we use these resources and recommendations to inform our own work? Megan's going to go into a little bit more of an example of this, but I just kind of wanted to give like an overarching idea of how you can use these survey findings. You know, we can use provider motivations to figure out what to focus on when trying to get buy-in from sites and administrators, developing programs, building materials, and promoting farm to ECE programs. We can look at the main barriers, facilitators, funding, and reach data. When determining the what, the who, and the where to focus our energies, and in grant and funding strategies, policy, technical assistance, resource development, you know, basically everything under the sun there. And all of this data can also be used for promotion and to build a case for policy and funding. And in addition, states can use their state level data. So, you know, we have the state level data available and ready on the page for you all if you want to check that out. But I have another poll for us all. So bear with me here. And this is just to see if you reviewed your state level data and if your state has its own farm to ECE survey. All right, it looks like about 20% have reviewed state level data, or 25%, 75% haven't, and about 20% of us have our own state farm to ECE survey, which is great. 13% do not, and about 65% don't know. So I'll share those results. So yeah, you know, state level farm to ECE surveys are great, and they're becoming more and more popular. And they're a really wonderful way to get a clear picture of what's needed within your own farm to ECE community. But we also have our state level data that you can use. And you can use this data to inform your own strategies, learn more about the specific needs in your state, persuade decision makers, and as a reference when you're building your own farm to ECE survey, if that's something that your state decides to do. And then just like as a little kind of side note tip, when you look at your state level data, you could also look at the response rate in your state. You know, if it's very, very low, this might be an indicator to how stretched providers are, and kind of spark that conversation on strategies you can use to gather your own data to find out what's happening in your state. And that'll maybe get a higher response rate or make more sense for providers in your region. So now I'm going to hand it back over to Megan for a case study.
Thanks, Sophia. I feel like you're also sharing one of the big themes of our Mitten state data. And if we have any friends from Wisconsin on, I know that y'all like to be a Mitten too. So you can be the other half of our Mitten as we're enjoying some rain and maybe some snow in our state today. We in Michigan, we looked at the state data, we looked at the survey data, but we also looked at some other important pieces of information. So it's important to note that Michigan was one of the states that was selected in the stratification of the sample for the Midwest. And for this next section, we'll share how we use those state level findings, but also we used it as part of other data and information to inform our work. So it's important to note that it's in early childhood and like with other areas of education, multiple assessments, multiple times. So you want to have lots of data available. We had also engaged in focus groups as part of our Farm to ECE implementation grant or FIG funding. And so for the purpose of this workshop, we thought it would be helpful to share how we engaged in that process, looking at this national survey data. So just as we did with the national data, we'll take a look first at who completed the survey. And Sophia already alluded to that, like looking at the data and the completion rate, just to get a sense of the data. What's also important to note too is going back to that larger survey information to see how providers got the survey. So Michigan was one of the states where the actual survey was sent directly to the providers by the state. So it was not sent as part of that Qualtrics data or that survey. So whereas the national researchers, we sent the survey initially September 8th, and then they received 2 reminders. We asked states to send reminders, but we don't know if that actually happened. And so that may or may not have affected the response rate. And that's also important to keep in mind when you're looking at this data. So looking at state data in this way is also important, as Sophia said, because it tells us not only who responded, but who didn't respond. And so that can give us an indication, okay, now we need to fill in these gaps. And it gives us a sense of not only the data we have, but the data that we need. And as you can see on the slide, Michigan had 288 total respondents, and 233 indicated that they had participated or were participating in Farm to ECE. At the time of this survey, that was fall of 2021, and in December of 2022, so a little bit later, a year later, we pulled data for a different purpose to see how many sites we had in the state, and that was about 11,600. So we're fairly confident that we didn't have too many states gained or lost during that time. So that gives you a sense about the completion rate that we had, and that's about a 2% response rate for the state of Michigan. We also wanted to look at the provider type. So remember, this survey is looking at site type in a really nuanced way. So we had center, family childcare, there's preschool, Head Start, early Head Start, all of those different types. And the state of Michigan breaks it down for us. So we have center and then 2 types of home provider. So we can't do like a site-to-site comparison, but when you look at the different provider types, you can see on this pie chart here, we had 31% that were childcare centers, 45% that are family childcare, 12% that are private preschool, and then another or other is 12%. And in that data that we pulled this past December, it doesn't exactly line up the configuration for the national survey. We know based on that data that we pulled from 2022 that our state has about 48% that's center-based and 52% when you combine both of those 2 types of family-based childcare. So we're a little bit off there, but again, 2% response rate. And you'll keep hearing that over and over again. 45% of the participants from this survey from Michigan indicated they were participating in Farm to ECE for less than 3 years. And that last bit of data seems to reflect what we know about the relative newness of our Michigan Farm to ECE network too. And I also want to pull up a comment that April made in the chat about the extent to which providers might be engaging or doing Farm to ECE, but not calling it that. And that's something else that we've been exploring more recently in our Farm to ECE work in our state. So next slide, please. Okay, so when we looked at the data a little bit more, we've shared on this slide the top 5 activities, which are very similar. They almost identically mirror, with some exception about the ranking, what we saw in the national data. And it's important to note that serving locally grown food, educating about locally grown food and gardening, and then those are really what we consider those 3 core elements. Those are making the top 3 for our state. When we look at the top motivators in our state, that's not on this slide, so you'll just have to hang out and listen to me for a second. But the top motivators in our state, and we looked at that just in terms of what providers considered were the very important only: improving children's health, that was on our national ranking, teaching about where food comes from and how it grows, and providing fresh, high quality food. Those were their top 3 motivators. So again, with that national data, remember, external funding was not something our providers were really commenting on. They didn't have external funding. That was true for Michigan data too. Only 7% of our participants said that they were receiving external funding. 85% were not receiving any external funding for farm to ECE activities. So when I think about that, or stated another way, respondents were engaging in farm to ECE if they were doing it without the benefit of external funding. Again, here's that theme. Michigan had a 2% response rate. So there's caution with that headline. What we don't want to be advertising is that people can do this without funding. That's not necessarily the case. The case is that of that 7%, 59% said that they were receiving in-kind donations. Another 41% were receiving money from private sources. They're making do. They shouldn't have to. That's really the take home here. And we were interested in local purchasing and how we could maybe increase these opportunities. So we want to look at that data again more closely, bearing in mind, right, we only have 2% of the folks that are able to do that, are able to complete this survey. So 62% of our participants were saying that 50% of their purchases are locally grown or produced. So of those that said they were buying local, 50% of those food purchases were locally grown or produced. Where are they getting their food? 71% it's from grocery stores. Well, it makes sense. If you're strapped for time, if you're thinking about what's most convenient for you based on when you have time to go get things, especially since most of the participants from this survey were indicating that they were family-based childcare, they're going to grocery stores. And that mirrors what we got from the FIG focus groups, because they were saying, I'm doing everything in one shopping trip because that makes the most sense for me. When we're looking at what they're specifically buying, 24% said for daily food purchasing, or what they were serving on a daily basis. 24% said it was fruit, another 24% said vegetables, and 28% bought milk. And we're going to return to that in a minute. Another area that our Farm to ECE network, and especially our FIG team, is really interested in is that CACFP participation, because it can help leverage some funds for supplementing in terms of tasting demonstrations, but also just general food purchasing. And like the national data, 46% of participants were participating in CACFP. It's a mouthful to say. Again, we have to look at that with a little bit of caution because it's a small sample size and we want to think about the total number of providers in our state. So let's go to the next slide and we can probably zip through this pretty quickly because it's fairly identical to what we see at the national level. When we look at the challenges that participants in the survey identified, the data is not that surprising compared to that national data. Cost rises to that top. When we look at food purchasing or procurement, cost is rising to the top, and money is mirroring that on the farm to ECE activity side. Again, considering that only 7% of our survey participants were receiving external funding, this challenge is probably even less surprising to see. And if we summarize the rest of the challenges, we have staff knowledge, which is just the best way to probably summarize that, with the exception of maybe seasonality and storage on that procurement or food purchasing side. Noting that staff time to prepare local foods, that makes sense in an ECE setting, and that was tied with obtaining information about product availability. Next slide. So pardon the pun, but where are we ripe for opportunity? Well, in Michigan, there is actually a lot of opportunity and we have to think about how we can take advantage of that. So I feel like this is where we should be all like coming off of mute and like all together now. We have to look at this data with some caution because of the response rate, but we group these into 3 areas based on the data and opportunity that was presented in this. In that data. So what do we mean? So we'll start with those daily foods served and that 24 fruit and vegetable and 28% with the milk. And that feels like we can do better than that. So remember when we were looking at folks saying serving locally grown foods and meals and snacks, and we can look at that local purchasing more closely, that 50% of their purchases were locally grown or produced, but most of them are getting food in grocery stores. Okay, 46% of them were using CACFP. That's an opportunity. And one of my colleagues brought up a great point the other day when she was saying, well, local is however you define it. So local to me might mean, well, I just went to my grocery store down the street. That's local. But do I know how to identify if the product itself is locally grown, locally produced? And do I know why that matters? So if I'm shopping at a grocery store, can I be aware of what a local product is and how to purchase that? And so that could be a starting point or an entry point for sourcing local. And then that can be expanded to purchasing at farmers markets or getting into a CSA or whatever opportunity makes sense for the provider, but starting where the provider is in that moment of sourcing local milk, turning the milk over and finding where that source code is to know. So it goes from 28% who are serving milk daily to 100% who are sourcing local milk daily. And there are two other things that offer opportunity here. So you see the CACFP and Go Knapsack. So let's talk a little bit about that. The first is encouraging more providers to leverage CACFP and making it easier for them to do so. It can positively impact their purchasing power. And we need to explain why and help them understand how to go through those forms, because the forms can be a barrier and we don't have to make it difficult. But when we look more closely at those daily foods served, when 24% were serving fruit or the same for vegetables or only milk, utilization of CACFP can help to reduce some of those sourcing barriers and cost barriers. It can also help programs to meet those guidelines for serving specific foods. So more programs would be serving locally sourced fruits and vegetables and milk or other products every day. That's one thing. The other thing is, why Go Knapsack? So in Michigan, we especially like this tool because it's a validated self-assessment tool, but it enables our providers to see what they're already doing well. So it's, where are your strengths? Where can you focus your energy? So you know you're already doing really well in this particular area. Keep doing that. You know you can continue to do that and you're doing awesome. But then focus your time and energy on one or two new things. So start small and build on it. And that goes back to Sophia's earlier comment, where if you're doing one thing, you're more likely to be engaged in Farm to ECE and build on it. So Go Knapsack allows them to develop an action plan with specific goals. You can check it off. Sometimes I'll even tell my providers, like, put one thing on the list you're already doing so you can cross it off and you know you've done it. Like, it's the best thing to do on your own to-do list. Do it here. And then you reassess to know that you've achieved your goals and you keep making that incremental progress. A bonus in our state is that we have trainings in Go Knapsack that are, well, everybody has those trainings, but the trainings in Go Knapsack are linked to our professional development system, and the sites that are using Go Knapsack can complete the trainings and receive those credits for free. They can do them all as a group. Their center director can go in and put all of their My Registry numbers in, they get credit for them, and it's awesome. And it helps to address some of those challenges, like limited staff knowledge on local foods or limited staff knowledge on gardening. And so that's helping to address that motivation piece, but also the daily food served. So it's really kind of a win-win there. This also helps when we're thinking about some additional webinars that have been sponsored by our Farm to ECE network. We just wrapped up a training on indoor gardening, and that was completed by over 400 providers. We have one about how Farm to ECE supports social emotional development, and we just released one about shared language. So having those free online webinars can help to address some of those motivations that we've already talked about. The last category, it's that money category, right? Like, this should just be all dollar bills. And I think it's one that we're all trying to figure out. We saw it in the chat, like, why don't we have those kitchen equipment grants or the same things that are happening for K through 12? And one of the things that we've talked about in our state is sustainability for programs. So how do we get a program going so that it doesn't rely on the continuous infusion of grants, but it can maintain momentum within the community? And so we've had the procurement pilots as one example of an attempt to initiate sustainability. We have small investments at sites to establish on-site gardening and purchasing smaller kitchen equipment like blenders or measuring cups and spoons and child-safe knives for tasting demonstrations. And our colleagues at MSU Extension are also piloting a CSA. It's a learning collaborative as a way of addressing some cost challenges for family-based providers. But it's important to note that it's also addressing the challenges of daily food served and motivations. And these are small incremental changes that we would like to see sustained over time. But the larger barrier is some of the same things that y'all have noted in the chat, that we need larger systemic change. And so most importantly, we need to create that foundation for any of our strategies by acknowledging the priorities that have been identified by our network in terms of the racial equity assessment tool debrief document and the priorities that we developed, which underscores and creates a foundation for all of this work. I'm trying to keep an eye on time too, because I can't see the chat when I have my slides up. So I think that's probably where we are at with Michigan. And I'm seeing some comments, but that would be where I think that would lead us into questions. Also, I want to acknowledge all of our Food Corps members who have joined us too, which is just awesome.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. I just want one quick second to do a shout out to some of our other resources, and also just want to reflect what Megan said is kind of, it comes down to, we need really big systemic changes to create infrastructure for farm to ECE. There was a comment in the chat about, with no funding, there's no sustainability, and seeing this time and time again. And that's kind of what we're trying to avoid, and what we need to work towards, what Megan said. So thank you for Megan. Thank you to Sandra in the chat. Anyway, so farm to ECE resources. For those of you that aren't familiar with NFSN or aren't tapped into our farm to ECE network, I would recommend checking out our farm to ECE landing page, which is linked here, and we will be sharing the recording and the slides to registrants and putting it up on our website, so you'll have access to all of these links. That's where we keep, that landing page is where we keep all of our key resources. We also have our resource database, which has just this giant comprehensive resource hub of ours and partners' resources from across the country, and it's been going for many, many years. So you can look in there for more. And if you would like to become a partner, you can click on that link there. It's free and really open to anyone. You can join as an individual or an organization. And that will give you access to our newsletter, our partner listserv, and any sort of upcoming NFSN opportunities. Then finally, our Farm to ECE listserv. This is specific for the Farm to ECE community. You can email me at sophia@farmtoschool.org to join that listserv. And that's where we and our partners share opportunities, events, funding, new resources, and the community can ask questions from each other on different farm to ECE work that they're doing. All right, next slide. And then some of our other evaluation resources, if you're looking for more farm to ECE evaluation, we have our Farm to ECE Shared Metrics Toolkit that we developed in collaboration with Policy Equity Group. And this is really just this huge spreadsheet of outcomes, indicators, and measures specific to Farm to ECE, as well as tools and resources to help you plan your own Farm to ECE evaluation, and can also be used for planning and implementing other Farm to ECE programming. And then our Farm to ECE self-assessment that we developed with the Association of State Public Health Nutritionists is this menu of options for Farm to ECE activities, and can help you gauge where you are in comprehensiveness to that specific Farm to ECE strategy. And it's designed for providers and those who work with providers to plan programming, gauge programming, along with an action planning template, and also can be used as an assessment, like a pre-post assessment for different programs as well. And yeah, I think that is it. And I think we're ready. We have about 4 minutes for questions.
So, Sophia, I don't know if you can see Tina's question, but I'm wondering, and Tina, you might offer in the chat or come off mute and confirm. So the survey that the ECE, Farm to ECE survey that is a partnership between NFSN and MSU CRFS, some of that is, you might find in the Farm to ECE metrics. And I'm not sure if I'm completely following your question about the US states data for Farm to ECE as a network.
Because some states that does a lot of surveys, they have a web link on all sort of like all the US data linked regarding any nutrition program. Would Farm to ECE with your organization has that too?
So Sophia, that should be on the NFSN website. Isn't the all the Farm to ECE data housed there?
Could you say that one more time? Sorry, Tina. I was trying to read the question and listen at the same time.
Right. I'm just wondering if your organization has like all the US states data in regards of Farm to ECE.
I don't think we house that.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
it's like the census data where you click and you get to know the SNAP, the WIC, and all the stuff. I know because I came from California and we have those where you click on certain counties and they have those programs. I'm wondering if your organization would have that for all states regarding Farm to ECE as a network organization.
Yeah, we don't have that data currently. We are working, I don't know if this would be as helpful, but we're currently working on a state strategy map. So it would be where you'd be able to click into that state and see what strategies they've worked on, what funding sources they've used. And that could help with informing other states' own work. But yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Maybe in the future for funding again. So,
Yeah.
I know due to inflation, that's the issue all the time with funding.
Yeah.
And then Nicole asked a question about food safety plans and Farm to ECE, and it looks like Amia answered that, and Sandra, I hope either of those versions answers that question. There's also the National Farm to School Network's food safety for producers, but that's a little bit different. And MSU Extension, we've modified that workshop for producers, but that's a little bit different than what you are looking at. But Nicole, if you want to contact me offline, we can also chat about what that looks like too. A group of partners in Michigan created modified the existing training so that it's more specific to farmers and food producers for early care and education. But EMEA's offering of briefs, and then UGA and their food safety information might be enough for what you need. And I'm also being aware of time. Are there did we miss any other questions?
I don't think so. We have about 1 minute. So if anyone has a question we haven't answered, feel free to share it in the chat or just come off mute. All right, well, again, like I said, we'll be sharing the slides and the recording with you all. And if you have any more questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself and Megan. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and our ability to share our results with you.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.